Welcome back to the Nate Wenke Podcast. Thanks for listening in. And today we're going to talk about 10 global trends every smart person should know. And this is a book by Marion Toupé and Ronald Bailey. And I first came across this book when I was listening to a podcast with Jordan Peterson and Marion Toupé. And full disclaimer, I have not actually read the book. So I'm really doing a podcast on the interview of Marion Toupé on Jordan Peterson. And then I believe I listened to him on one or two other podcasts that I can't recall the names of. But I listened to a couple interviews with him. And the book and the interviews basically outline they make the case that it is in fact rational to have an optimistic view of the future. And if you pay attention to news, media, the general news cycle, what you notice is 9 out of 10 times the stories that you were presented with are inherently negative or have a negative bent. It's very rare to have a significant number of stories populate the front of a newspaper that are in fact positive. And there's a couple different reasons for this. One of the most simple ones is simply that negative news sells better than positive news. And if you're in a media organization that, like cable news, that's slowly dying by all available metrics, you're going to try to get as much clicks as you possibly can. Danger sells, it turns out. So we're constantly surrounded by this doom and gloom perspective. The Population Bomb by Paul Ehrlich was written, I believe, in the 1980s. And he made the case that we would overpopulate and ultimately starve. And what's interesting about today is that we are in the exact opposite situation. Our greatest threat in terms of population is depopulation. It's population collapse. It's a complete shifting of the ratio of old to young to the point where our economies, which are built upon the presupposition that we're going to continue to have an ever-increasing percentage of young people to old people, that ratio is about to be inverted. And a lot of countries like Japan and South Korea are actually experiencing that right now. And I've done a whole podcast on that. So if you're interested in that topic, I highly recommend checking that out. But we've been fed this doom and gloom image of the future. And it's just not statistically true. When you look at the data, as Marion Toupé has done, you'll notice that the trends are actually positive, not negative. And that doesn't mean that there aren't still problems that we have to tackle. Overall, there's a very coherent, rational case to be rationally optimistic about the future. So one of the reasons that I wanted to talk about this was because I've spent in the past episodes a lot of time on more negative subjects. AI has both positive and negatives, but I talk a lot about the negatives, a lot about the problems. I talked at length about certain social contagions and ideological movements within the West specifically that I believe are a detriment to the overall mental health and clarity of people in general. I've done the depopulation episode. I spent quite a bit of time on topics that are not overly positive. So I wanted to kind of switch it up and focus on something that I have found very useful and something that has changed my perspective about the future. I was far more nihilistic when I was younger, although I'm not that old, but in high school, I had a much more nihilistic view of the world, but when I went into the data was pretty clear that overall trends, especially from an economic perspective, are getting better from a human prosperity perspective. Again, that doesn't mean we don't have challenges to face. Overfishing of the oceans, climate change, depending on what severity of a threat you actually feel that is. We have serious threats from AI. We have threats from authoritarian regimes that have an edge on democratic states in terms of their ability to wage war and make coordinated moves from a geopolitical perspective. So we have some serious problems, but I thought it would be useful to focus on some of these positive aspects. One other predicate here is that humanprogress.org is run by, I believe, Marion Toupé or one of his associates. I know they're all kind of within the same group, I suppose. So, but humanprogress.org, they have a page on Twitter, and if you dare to dip your toe in the Twitterverse on a regular basis, which I don't recommend, I've actually been on a hiatus from Twitter for quite a while, but when I was on Twitter more, I ensured that I followed humanprogress.org, and sure enough, every day there'd be, or nearly every day, there'd be some post that they talk about something positive. And within Twitter, that was a breath of fresh air that was refreshing and needed in the oh-so-fun world of Twitter. which is absolutely nothing like human life, by the way. So yeah, highly recommend humanprogress.org. In fact, if you just want like a resource just to like look into some of these trends, if you don't want to buy the book or you don't want to listen to the full length podcast or whatever, highly recommend their stuff. Super informative. They have a really good YouTube channel, a lot of good videos on this kind of stuff. So highly recommend. But let's kind of jump into it. So just looking at the way that, let's just do America. Americans, when were surveyed in 2016, and 65% thought the world was getting worse, and only 6% thought it was getting better. And the book makes the case that I'll read from the, essentially their little intro. The uncontroversial data on major global trends in this book will persuade you that this dark view of the state of humanity in the natural world is in large part badly mistaken. And here are a couple overarching, I'd call them mega statistics. Like these are like the big ones that are relevant that the book touches on specifically. And it's that world population is going to peak at around 8 to 9 billion. So overpopulation is not a thing. It's a lie. It will not happen. One of the biggest threats in the next 50 years will be depopulation. And all the data points to that. So you can just let that go to die. Global, and this is one way to measure this, is through global fertility rates. So we averaged around 6 children per woman in 1960, and we're about 2.4 globally. You need about 2.1 to maintain the population. That's the magic number as of right now, given different mortality rates and whatnot. That's the R naught number for a COVID reference. Many nations, specifically Western countries or more developed countries, are well below that 2.1 metric. Japan and South Korea are going to go through a storm, and currently are, of collapsing birth rates, which turns out to be quite the problem when your economies are based upon that model. Another mega statistic, the global absolute poverty rate has fallen from 42% in 1981 to 8.6% today. From an environmental perspective, satellite data show that the forest area has been expanding since 1982. Natural resources are becoming ever cheaper and more abundant. And since 1900, the average life expectancy has more than doubled, reaching 72 years globally. And it's far higher in Western countries. Those are some good mega statistics to kind of start us off here. Now, I do want to quickly go through these 10 global trends. This will not be a long episode. There's a ton of statistics that go along with this. I will attempt to not bore you with all of them, and I tried to go through some of the more relevant ones. And another keynote here is that the trends fit within a broader, trend, mega trend, mega statistic, whatever you want to call it, within a broader perspective about, general rational optimism is the overall trend. They're segmented and a lot of them overlap. So it's not going to be like a perfect, here's number 1 to number 10. They're intertwined to a large degree. So the first one the book starts off with is improved quality of life. Over the past 200 years, there's been significant progress in terms of accountability, equality before law, freedom, innovation, and prosperity. And this is the big statistic here, is this has led to 100-fold growth in the world's economy and a rise in standard of living since about 1800. And then a couple of the statistics that go along with this, and I'll take another step back here. What's relevant here is why? Why have we been so successful? What have been the chief mechanisms by which this has taken place? And the short answer is capitalism. The long answer is quite a bit more complicated than that, but the short answer is free trade, which is, and this is my personal opinion, that the basis for capitalism, the basis for this idea that you have a right to your own labor, which I think we take for granted today, because that was not the case for literally all of history. The idea that you had certain inalienable rights, or that you had a right to your own labor, was absolutely foreign. That was not the case at all, basically anywhere, ever in history, until the United States came on the scene. the Constitution of the United States is, in my opinion, one of the, if not the most unlikely documents ever to be written. So now it depends on what you mean by unlikely. If you look at, the different pressures in terms of Britain and different, the perfect storm, I suppose, of what happened with the American colonies, you can make a case that it was likely in that context, and I understand that. But in terms of the actual substance of the document, there's a lot in there that, from a historical perspective, is completely foreign and would have been not even considered as a possible way of setting up a system of governance. Specifically, the idea that you are imbued with inalienable rights, the right to free speech, the right to own property, even the right to bear arms. These are things that are foreign in the context of history and sit at the base of a free society that is allowed towards the explosion of productivity and prosperity that has been a result of such things. So when you say capitalism, you tend to focus on the economics of the term, and I mean that makes a certain amount of sense. However, what are the underlying ideals and the why behind why capitalism works? And I would make the case that that is found in the Judeo-Christian set of values that posits that you are made in the image of God. And what that means, if I dare to try to understand what that means, is that regardless of your socioeconomic status, regardless of your birth, your caste, whom you were born to, your name, your gender even, you have a spark of the divine within you that has intrinsic value that's not given to you by the state, that's not given to you by society, but is given to you by God. And whether or not you believe in God is in some sense besides the point here. The point is that you have this and no one has the right to take it away from you. And the basis of the Constitution and the three branches of government set up by it was designed to protect these rights. That was the basis of governance for the Americans. And hypothetically still today, although that seems to be, what would you say, degenerating rather terrifyingly quickly. But that was the basis here, this idea that you're made in the image of God, this idea that you have the right to your own labor and the fruits of it. And this is where capitalism gets in my opinion, simplistic negative bend. Because people think, capitalism is just greed, and that's at the center of it. I prefer the term rational self-interest. If you have the choice between allowing your family to flourish or not, you would pick flourishing. That's not evil. That's not greedy in any serious sense. That's just rational. So capitalism set the stage for people to bear the fruits of their own labor. That every bit more that you worked, you had the opportunity to get more money. If you made something more efficient, you got to benefit from that efficiency upgrade. If you invented something, you had the rights to that thing such that people weren't allowed to copy it, hypothetically, at China. And you then got to benefit from your direct creativity. And this is a massive incentive structure to actually be more productive and more efficient with resources. And that is at the basis of capitalism. And that was the fueling fire and the set of ideals that laid the groundwork for the greatest economy in the history of the world and a exponential curve of growth. Basically, if you were to graph GDP per capita for basically all of history, you'd see basically a flat line. So for thousands of years, there's been this nice flat line. And then if you look at around 1800-ish, really took off in the 1900s. But if you look around 1800, you notice this curve. And that curve, the farther you expand that out, you only have to go out a couple centuries until that curve is basically a straight line up. So we've had this exponential increase in productivity, efficiency, resources that's led to an exponential increase in human prosperity. And I've mentioned this before, but humanprogress.org, they did a article on, they compared the life of Rockefeller, who was effectively the richest man in the early 1900s, to the life of your average poor person in the United States today. And they said, okay, who would you rather be? The richest man 100 years ago or your average poor person in the United States today? And the article, in my opinion, lays out rather undisputably that you would rather be the poor person in the United States today than the richest man 100 years ago. And that is I highly recommend that article. That's a simple yet powerful example to simply how good we have it today. So I thought that was relevant here. Here's a couple interesting statistics on like human prosperity as such. Life expectancy has been a big one. In 1800, global life expectancy was around 30 years. In 2019, it's approximately 73 years worldwide. In rich, developed countries, that's hitting mid-80s. Education, this has been a big one. Access to education has improved worldwide. Literacy rate has risen significantly. We have a global literacy rate of around 86% for adults aged 15 and above. And that was 12% in 1820. So another exponential increase there. Child mortality rates have dropped significantly. And this is a very good metric, especially for countries that are young. One way to measure, basically, like measure earlier. I may have this messed up, but it's a good metric to see how well off a country's doing and how well off a society's doing in general is their infant mortality rates. And we'll do globally. There's a under 5. Reports that the global under 5, so the age of 5, mortality rate declined from 93 deaths per 1,000 live births in 1990 to 38 per 1,000 live births in 2019, and that's a more than twofold decline in deaths, and that's over the span of 30 years. I don't have it in front of me, but the 1900 metric compared to now, or the 1800 metric, is an exponential decline. So we're talking about, I think, about a third of babies died before the age of 5 back in 1800, and now we're talking a tenfold, roughly speaking, decrease in that. So just massive here. Clean water is another good one. Percentage of global population with access to clean water sits around 91% of the global population has access to some form of improved drinking water. So that's the first major trend, is kind of what I just outlined. It's just this improved quality of life. Those are a couple statistics to go off of. There's an endless list. I mean, you can just go down the list here. And we got a couple more that are good here too. There's been a massive decline in poverty. Over the last 25 years, approximately 137,000 people have been lifted out of extreme poverty every single day. Population growth and decline. The world's population has grown from 1 billion in 1800 to 7.8 billion today. It's probably going to peak around 9 billion in 2060, according to certain projections, and will start really declining by 2100, which is going to present some interesting challenges, and I explore those in a previous episode. Highly recommend it. It's one of those topics that like no one seems to be aware of. Like really, very few people seem to be aware of population collapse as a risk, and it just doesn't have the same like existential threat type of like ring the bells appeal to it. Like it doesn't seem as scary. Like, oh, population collapse, and fair enough. And yet, I think Elon Musk got it right when he says it's going to be one of the biggest problems we face in the next couple decades. Is population collapse. Massive. Okay, this is another misconception. This is one of the fatal flaws of Paul Ehrlich's analysis, was when he declared that we would all essentially starve and die from overpopulation and then not enough food. He miscalculated because he assumed that our yield per acre would remain stagnant, that we would not be able to make more food per acre and become more efficient and more productive with a smaller amount of land. We have managed to do that in massive ways. GMOs have been a massive productivity enhancer in that realm. And okay, quick thing here about GMOs, because I know some people hate GMOs for whatever reason. Couple things. One, we've been genetically modifying crops since the dawn of agriculture. Now, before people get mad, yes, the modern GMOs today, it's different than the natural genetic selective mechanisms that we had in the past. Yes, this is true. Now, you can go down the GMO rabbit hole. I'm not saying you shouldn't. You could go down that rabbit hole. Something called the Irish potato famine. And the Irish potato famine, potatoes got a disease called, what was this, 1900s? I'm going to find out real quick. Irish potato. That was in, 1845. Yeah, so I thought it was 1900s. Geez, I was way off there. I believe it was, so it killed about 1 million people, the Irish potato famine. And it was all from this disease called late blight. It affected potatoes, hence the name. And, well, it turns out today that we have a GMO potato that is I think it's actually immune to late blight. So, people have problems with GMOs. Fair enough. I would posit that you can put all of the data that you have against GMOs, and then you can put that against even a single event, such as something like the Great Famine, the Irish potato famine, and just the introduction of a single GMO potato that is resistant to such thing and would prevent such a thing from happening in the future outweighs all of the cons that have been presented from the non-GMO crowd. Now, that may be a bold claim, and you can go fact check me on that if you so desire. Another resource there would be Real Science, great YouTube channel. They did a video on GMOs, and they analyzed just this reality, and they did an excellent analysis. And it's difficult to not come away with a more nuanced perspective on the issue. We have saved millions of people's lives with GMOs. We have improved hundreds of thousands of people's lives. There's something called yellow rice, I believe is what it's called. Golden rice, something like that, where people were going blind because they didn't have enough vitamin A, I believe. One of the vitamins that people were going blind, thousands were going blind, and simply with this introduction of a type of rice that has the proper micronutrients in it, people are no longer going blind. And yes, it's a GMO. So everything has to be a cost-benefit analysis. Could it hypothetically be better if you ate organic? Sure. Can the entire world have organic food and still sustain itself? No. Organic is a product of the rich. And ultimately, if you look at yields per acre, if you look at what we're actually capable of producing with organic farming versus conventional farming, you'll find that it can only, if we did everything organic, it'd only feed, I think, about a third, half the globe. Not the whole globe is the point there. So everything has to be looked at from a cost-benefit perspective. GMOs is the same thing, man. Same thing. You can't simply misconstrue them as inherently bad when they're saving millions of people's lives. So if you want to go down that rabbit hole, look at the Real Science video. I'll do that. I think it does a very good analysis of looking at it. Okay, off that tangent. So that had to do with this whole resource abundance concept of like, okay, so Paul Ehrlich, we'll go back to his lovely proclamation. Yeah, he was exactly wrong because he underestimated our ability to produce more with less. And that's the story of capitalism. That's the story of the current environment in terms of natural resources. This idea that we're going to run out of natural resources just basically isn't true. It's the same with fossil fuels. It's like, oh, we're going to run out of fossil fuels. It's like, well, not really. It just gets more expensive to get them out of the ground, is essentially the analysis. Until we develop technologies that make it easier, such as fracking. So it's not just as simple as like, we're going to run out. It gets more expensive to do it. Then the economic pressures and incentives push us towards developing easier and cheaper ways of getting it out of the ground. And then suddenly what previously would have been, let's say, untenable areas to mine for fossil fuels because it wouldn't have been worth the cost suddenly become worth the cost. So it's way more complicated than just the simple we're going to run out. We've just gotten way better at things. Let's do the United States. Corn yields per acre have more than doubled since the 1970s due to advancement in technology and farming practices. The global production of fish, this is a cool one, from aquaculture, love that name, gets told fish farming, has increased nearly 12-fold since 1990. That's pretty neat. More fish. Like me some salmon. Hope we got some salmon lovers out there. So that's pretty neat, the whole resource abundance thing. It turns out that we actually are far more efficient at preserving resources and that we're not just running out of things. And since someone's going to yell about the trees, I'm going to bring them up. Gotta love me some trees. This is the next trend they talk about. As people become wealthier, there's a greater emphasis on environmental care, and urbanization and technological advancements have led to increased reforestation. Jeez, can't even speak. With the overall global tree canopy expanding. Let's look at the United States. The United States experienced a positive net change in forest area over the past century. Since the early 1900s, the U.S. has gained over 3 million hectares, I believe. I can never say it right. Hectares of forested land, which is basically just a shit ton of acres. From a global perspective, global forest area increased by 7.8 million hectares per year between 2010 and 2020, compared to a net loss of around 6.8 million hectares per year in the 1990s. Man, I'm gonna find out later that I'm saying that completely wrong, and then I'm just gonna smack myself over the face. But whatever. So this is part of the general trend here. Just for more context, is we tend to have this view of cities as like a negative impact on the environment. It turns out that's not true. So it turns out that urbanization and the aggregation of resources into smaller land masses is actually good for the environment, because that means that area in land that used to be, you can imagine a dispersed human presence over, 100 square miles, or a concentrated human presence over a single square mile, just for, argument's sake. Well, that means that other 99 square miles can be returned to forest and fields and farmland. And you don't have the same sprawl, let's say, of people. And that's not the perfect analysis or way of describing it, but essentially urbanization is good for the environment overall. Technological advances is good for the environment. It turns out that it's a hell of a lot better to burn natural gas than animal dung. And this is just one of the broad points here is, do you know who are the worst environmentalists? The poor. Because they don't give a damn. Because their kids are starving, because they don't have clean drinking water. Because in their priorities, the hypothetical 1 to 2 degree warming of the earth in 100 years that may or may not happen, depending on which expert you happen to ask, they don't care about that. They care about feeding their children. And they also happen to be the worst polluters because they're using the most archaic forms of energy production and food production. So it turns out that it's a hell of a lot better to burn coal than wood. And natural gas beats the shit out of coal, and nuclear beats the shit out of natural gas. So urbanization, technological advance is good for the environment, not bad. So what are we going to do? Are we going to tell these poor countries that they're not allowed to urbanize? That they're not allowed to produce coal and mine coal and actually become like us because we're oh so moral? Because that's what's happening right now. We're basically telling poor countries in South Africa that we don't want you to urbanize because it's bad for the environment, which is quite the incredible thing to say because we're the ones that have urbanized. So, no, it turns out that this is the case that, someone like Bjorn Lomborg will make, and Marion Toupé, whom, in my opinion, does the single best, most nuanced analysis of the current climate change data and the proper way to tackle it that I've seen from anyone. He does a fantastic analysis. And he takes this into account of like, look, man, it turns out that coal is better than wood. And that we don't have that perspective. We tend to think, okay, just solar and wind. And it's like, nope, not going to work. It's just not going to work. You need consistent baseload power to have a functioning economy. Look at California. Let's see how that goes. So, no, you need baseload power. You need a consistent flow of electricity, and you need to allow people to develop. Turns out that wealthy countries pollute less than poor countries, by far. You know, the trash in the world's oceans? Oh, I listened to a great podcast, Stuff You Should Know, that did, I think it was them. Oh gosh, I hope it was them. That or it was, what's his name? Oh, Jordan Harbinger. It might have been him. It was okay, both of them are good podcasts. Check out both. Way better than mine. They did, one of them, I cannot remember which one, I'm going to find out later, did a episode on where the majority of, they did a whole episode on like waste, junk waste, from countries, how much waste we have, how much trash we have, etc. And they found that there's like 5 to 10 countries that produce like 90% of the world's plastics in the oceans. So, and guess what? They're all poor as shit. So it turns out that getting countries richer as fast as possible might be the single best way to tackle climate change and overall environmentalism as such. And yet you don't really hear that from the environmentalist movement. You hear capitalism is bad. Capitalism produced the problems we have. Which, oh gosh, it's way more complicated than that. Capitalism has produced it. It turns out that we were all dying at the age of 20 from malaria over the past 100 years or 300 years. And that capitalism has ameliorated that, and now we actually don't die at the age of 20 as much as we used to. So it's not as simple as capitalism is to blame for environmentalism, that's for sure. But go do the data, or go look into the data yourselves. Bjorn Longberg, Marian Toupe, Matt Ridley. He's one of these same guys that, makes a case for rational optimism. Steve Kuhn, something like that. He does a good job. So, highly recommend their stuff. So urbanization is good. Cities are good overall. Urban dwellers tend to use less energy, emit less carbon dioxide, and occupy less land. Okay, next trend. Democratization and decrease in authoritarianism. So it turns out that the world is getting more free, less authoritarian, and in general, more democratic, which goes along with free. So here's some cool numbers. The numbers of countries classified as electoral democracies has significantly increased. In 1980, there were 62 electoral democracies, while in 2020, the number rose to 117. So massive increases there. The decline of authoritarian regimes in Africa specifically, this is pretty cool. From 1980 to 2020, the number of authoritarian regimes in the region decreased from 69 to 14. So was that a fourfold, roughly speaking, decrease in authoritarian regimes? Africa is going to be the new China, by the way. If you want to put some long-term investing money, Africa is probably the place. Fastest growing economies in the world are in Africa. It's pretty cool. Along with this, there's been a massive decline in wars. So there's an increase in the total number of countries. There's been a decline in wars between nations since World War II. And then furthermore, wars have become less deadly. And here's some statistics on that. The number of major wars defined as conflicts resulting in 1,000 or more battle-related deaths per year has declined significantly. In the 1950s, there was an average of 6 major wars per year, compared to less than 1 per year in the 21st century. That's pretty neat. Now, part of that can also be put at the feet of the atom bomb, which ironically could also be the end of us all. So, that's a weird one. That's an interesting moral one, because here we are, we've created this bomb that has effectively made the large-scale military wars of the past null. And we saw that specifically in the Cold War. And yet, even just a couple of these things can basically kill us all. So, it's not, let's just say the jury's still out on whether the atom bomb was actually a peacemaker or not, because, well, it, could destroy us all. So that would kind of negate the positive effects that we've experienced so far. But because this podcast is all optimistic, we'll stick with the less wars subject, shall we? All right, next topic, improved disaster preparedness. So this is another thing. It turns out that natural disasters are way, way less significant in terms of overall human death and mortality than they used to be. I mean, it's just massive. And this is where, again, the media can portray things falsely. You'll hear a lot of stats about, like, natural disasters cost us way more than they used to, which basically is true. It's because we build more shit in their way. It's like, do you know how many people live in Florida? Do you know how much development there's been in Florida over the past 100 years in prime hurricane territory? So it turns out that when you build more things in the way of natural disasters, things tend to cost more. So that's the story of the last 100 years in terms of cost. Now, what you also know is that we also build things better. So if you were to, there's some fascinating pictures of countries that have undergone, similar magnitude earthquakes or hurricanes or whatever it is. And you look at pictures from like 50 years ago to now in terms of damage, and it's night and day. Because when you get richer, you're able to build structures that are more solid, that stand up to Mother Nature better, and then also cause less mortality. So that's kind of the story of the last 100 years in terms of natural disasters and human deaths. Deaths have gone down precipitously. Overall damage from an economic perspective has gone up, technically speaking. Although, if you're to look at like damage to an individual building, that's gone way down. So it turns out to be a little bit more nuanced, as per the usual arrangement. This is the most relevant one here. The global death rate from natural disasters has been declining over the past century. In the 1920s, the average annual death toll from natural disasters was approximately 450,000. Well, in the 2010s, it decreased to around 60,000. Now, you could say, okay, well, what about population differences? And fair enough. Like that plays a role. But overall, we've seen a massive decrease in deaths from natural disasters, which has been huge. So that brings me to my last point, which is rational optimism. And I'll just summarize it here. While acknowledging that challenges still exist, it is important to celebrate the progress humanity has made. Developing a rationally optimistic view of the world can help drive further improvements. So that's kind of the overarching theme here, that Marian Toupe makes the case that, look, it is in fact rational to have an optimistic view of the future. Now, this is where I probably diverged from him a little bit. Under the metrics that he brought up, yes, wholeheartedly agree. However, we have, in my opinion, two large overhanging issues that weren't really addressed here. One is AI. The other is nuclear war. Because the reality is that nuclear war could take place at any time by a simple mistake. A deep analysis of nuclear disasters would point you to that we have come so damn close to nuclear war from things that were absolutely complete mistakes that it would be you'd almost laugh at how absurd it is. So we've had like the most perfect scenarios in the past where things should have gone to Armageddon. Like, by all available metrics, they should have gone to Armageddon, and yet they didn't. By the most insane chances. Go do that analysis. I'm not going to do it here. Go do the analysis. It's insane. So, as much as I like the rationally optimistic view, I also think that having a rational view of the dangers that we face is important. One would be nuclear war. Another would be AI. I think AI is probably going to be the biggest threat we face over the next 100 years. It also will be the biggest potential prosperity booster we have in our arsenal, which is what makes AI such a fascinating subject. Because on one hand, it's going to be the biggest threat we face, and on the other, it will also be the thing that we most need and want. So, hopefully that was a interesting analysis of what's going on right now, or I guess over the last 100 years in terms of human prosperity. Things are pretty good overall. And to save yourself some strife, some unnecessary strife, I would suggest shutting off the news permanently and maybe subscribing to humanprogress.org, checking them out every once in a while. Or at least, do a 50-50 take. If you're going to watch 10 minutes in the news, go read a 10-minute article, because you are being sold a lie about the current state of things. Selective mechanisms that pick bad events do a disservice to the actual state of things in the world. So, go on your own path, do the research, do the digging, look into the data, and look into how things are actually happening. Because they're trying to be doing pretty well. Thank you for listening. Pleasure as always.